So today what we're going to be talking about is God and the moral order. Okay, and we're going to talk about how the existence of morality argues for the existence of God. And so, kind of as an overview, I actually thought we're going to start out with C.S. Lewis. I thought about just reading you chapter 1 of C.S. Lewis because it does a really good job of explaining the moral order. So, but instead of reading the whole chapter, I have this selection here that I'll read for you. And so what C.S. Lewis says, he says, everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny, and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kinds of things they say. They say things like, how'd you like it if anyone did the same way to you? Or, that's my seat, I was there first. Leave him alone, he isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Or, give me a bit of your orange, I gave you a bit of mine. Or, come on, you promised. People say things like that every day, educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now, what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. And the other man very seldom replies, to hell with your standard. Nearly always he tries to make out what he has been doing does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, there's some special excuse. He pretends that there is some special reason in this particular case why the person who took the seat first should not keep it, or that things were quite different when he was given his bit of orange, or that something has turned up which lets him off keeping his promise. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law, or rule of fair play, or decent behavior, or morality, or whatever you call it, about which they really agreed. And they have. If they had not, they might, of course, fight like animals, but they could not quarrel in the human sense of the word. Quarreling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong. And there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. So that's kind of an overview of the moral argument. And he goes on to show that this is a universal standard. It's not based on individuals. This is in fact, that's what he's saying here, is that if it was just about preference, then that would be a quite different argument. If it was just about what you personally held to, that would be very, very different. But in fact, you're assuming that you and the person you're arguing with are both being held to the same standard external from both of you. So let's start with an overview of how the moral argument works. So it starts out saying that almost everyone thinks and behaves as if we are subject to a transcendent moral order. So second, if there is a transcendent moral order, there must be some reason for it. If there is a reason for it, and it transcends individual humans, it must exist outside of humans. There's no natural reason for a transcendent moral order to exist. Therefore, there must be a supernatural reason for a transcendent moral order. So that's kind of a sketch of where we'll be going today. We'll kind of go into each of these parts more in depth as we go on. But I want to first address some common misunderstandings about the moral order. So if you ever relate this to other people, it's very important to phrase it correctly because of how often it's misunderstood. The thing that most people misunderstand about it is many people think that the moral argument means that atheists can't be moral. Not only is this a misunderstanding, but if it were true, it would actually undermine the first premise of the argument. Because the moral argument is not about performance of morality. It's about whether or not you can ground morality. Can you give a reason for why there is a morality? It's not to say that people who don't know where morality comes from can't do morality. It just says that if you are going to give an account of why we are moral and why morality itself exists, it's hard to do that unless you also invoke God. So I want to share Romans 2:14 and 15 about this, because it actually holds very strongly that Christian theology says that non-Christians do perform moral acts. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things that are required by law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciousness also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. So basically he's saying that you don't have to know Christianity because the law is written on your hearts. And that allows it, so sometimes it's convicting, and sometimes it's defending what we do. And so we know the moral law because it's written on our hearts. So again, the moral argument is not about the performance of morality, but what does it mean if morality is real? How could something like morality come into existence? I think this leads to several important distinctions, and that I think that anytime we talk about morality and what it means, that we need to be clear about these things. First of all, there's knowing morality. Okay, knowing morality is the ability to know the right thing to do in a particular circumstance. Performing morality is the ability to perform actions that are consistent with this knowledge. All right, so you might know the right thing, but you might not do the right thing. Then there's grounding the morality, and this is the ability to understand the ultimate source of morality. So you might know the morality, you might do the morality, but you might not know where it comes from. Okay, so these are all different ideas. Then there's teaching morality, and that's the ability to teach others, your kids, other adults, how morality works. So you might know it, you might be able to perform it. That's separate from being able to teach it. Or you might know it and be able to teach it, but not be able to perform it. There's many people who are moralists who have engaged in immoral behavior, and so these are all important distinctions. And then there's sociological morality, and this is how people think and behave about morality in society. So this is about kind of studying what it is that people actually do and think. Okay, so there might be a transcendent morality that's different from how people actually act and behave in the real world. Sociological morality is about studying what's happening in a particular place and culture. And so a lot of people get these different ideas confused. And so it's important to keep these ideas separate so that we know that we're clear about what we're talking about, and that objections, people are clear about where the objection is coming from and what they're objecting to. So I've mentioned the word transcendent several times. So what does this have to do with morality? Okay. So first of all, you have to ask, what is morality? We use the word commonly, but rarely do we just sit back and reflect on what is it. Okay. And so there's actually several different accounts of morality that are kind of floating in the public mind. And these different accounts differ both in what they mean by morality and what it indicates. So there's the one that's probably the most common right now is socially constructed morality. And this view holds that each society develops its own rules for what is right and wrong, but there's no external template. So basically, each society simply constructs its own morality based on the individual preferences of the members and what they're trying to accomplish. Then there's individually constructed morality. This view says that the important thing is for the person to believe that they are doing the right thing. So basically, I construct my morality. I think about the way that I want to behave as a person, and therefore morality is whether or not I am performing consistently with the way that I want to be performing. Then there's evolutionary morality, and this view says that morality is an evolved brain response, similar to our desire for food, and it is neither external to us, nor can it be chosen. It's kind of like an itch. It's just something that physiologically that humans do. And then finally, there's transcendent morality, and this view holds that moral imperatives are objective. That means it's not dependent on who's perceiving it, and external to individual and societal preferences. and are largely independent of time, location, and situation. So basically, it says that it doesn't matter what I want. It doesn't matter what our society wants. There is a moral standard that we are all subject to, independent of our wishes. So, to gauge which of these are more in line, let's first think about what makes something moral, because there's a lot of things that we can classify things, and we use the term moral. What does that really mean? Okay, so when we use the term morality, we're usually referring to things that are standards of behavior, and that they're normative both for yourself and others. And that goes back to our original discussion about C.S. Lewis and his discussion about how people interact and how people say, well, you didn't do this and you should have. So these are normative not just for myself, but they're actually normative for other people. I expect others to follow it. And they're independent of what you believe about this morality. I think people should not steal from me, even if they think they have a right to my stuff. So it doesn't matter. I'm not checking thieves at the door and say, do you believe in this morality or not? It's independent of what you believe about the morality. The morality is true, no matter what your stated belief is. And it doesn't require prior consent for the need to be adhered to. This morality is true even if we were in the jungle and we had no society, we had no contracts. There is a basic morality that all people should be held responsible to. So this is inherent in the term morality, because if you think about it, we already have a term for preference. So if I just think that morality is preference, well, then that means morality doesn't exist, because we already have a term for that. So there's no reason to have a new term, morality, for something that we just mean preference. If we just mean laws, well, we already have legal processes. We can already say that this is illegal. There's no point in having a word immoral that means the same thing as illegal. So if you have, if you say, well, it's just based on your society's preferences, well, there's already terms that cover that. And so basically this leads transcendent morality to be the only thing that actually describes a morality that's not just equivalent to something else. So if you believe that morality is in fact a distinct idea, separate from preference, separate from just what happens to be the law at the time, separate from what I happen to think, what I happen to feel, morality actually has to be transcendent. Okay, so let's look at this term and how it compares to these other ones. So a socially constructed morality, that's mere social preference, and it's dependent on membership in a particular society. And so if you were to hold that, then you actually couldn't judge any other society, past or present, because that would just be another social construction. So I can't say that this society was immoral, because it's a different society. They have their own construction, and so they actually would be behaving morally. And C.S. Lewis in his book, he says, if morality is socially constructed, we have to go apologize to the Nazis because they were operating in their socially constructed morality. The whole reason for the war is because we believed that what they were doing was immoral, and they should have known better. And so if morality was just socially constructed, then we would have no basis to argue that the Nazis were wrong. We might say, well, we don't like it. Well, in that case, we're just going for war just because we don't like something. So that's the problem with socially constructed morality. Individually constructed morality is even worse. It's just bare preference. You can't make it normative for others because the definition is itself individualized. There's simply no difference between this and just saying, well, I just prefer that not to happen. Then there's evolutionary morality. And this is actually the same thing. This winds up being the same as socially constructed morality, but you kind of gives you a backstory as to why the different social constructions are similar. It actually gives you less reason to follow it, because there's actually no reason to presume that evolution is leading us down the best path. And in fact, anything that we do is, if you believe in evolutionary materialism, which is everything happens according to natural causes and led by evolution, well, then everything that I happen to do is also due to evolution. So no matter what I'm doing it because of evolution. So I can't say that I'm immoral according to evolution. I'm just, whatever I'm doing, it will be because of my genes. So evolutionary morality can't really give us a definition of morality. And so that basically leaves transcendent morality as the only account of morality that actually follows what we generally mean by it and doesn't devolve the term morality into something lesser. So what is this transcendent morality? Okay, so transcendent morality holds that there's a standard of morality. It exists outside of ourselves, and simply being a human makes this a compulsory standard. We have the right to expect others to follow the standard, and we have a duty to uphold the standard ourselves. Generally, anytime that you have a moral argument with someone else, you're assuming that they have the argument itself, as we mentioned in that introductory thing by C.S. Lewis, that these arguments are assuming a transcendent morality. And if you really think about it, socially constructed morality is really just might makes right using nicer terms. Because who is this social group that constructs morality? It would simply be the people who are in power at the time. Well, who gave them the powers? Well, it's whoever could take the most power. This is one of the things, I know a lot of Christians who really, really appreciate the philosophy of Nietzsche, not because they like Nietzsche. For those of you who don't know, Nietzsche was a philosopher who believed that he believed in the will to power, that you should basically do whatever you can to the extent that you can and lord it over whomever you can. And the reason why a lot of Christians appreciate this from Nietzsche is that Nietzsche made no pretense at holding, he was an atheist, and he didn't try to be, a lot of atheists try to be atheists but hold basically Christian morality. And what Nietzsche did is he decided that he would actually follow atheism where it went. And so when you read Nietzsche, you actually get a good sense of what is the philosophical consequences for morality for leaving Christianity. And so what you wind up with is this might makes right society, and that was Nietzsche's philosophy, and that's generally what you wind up with if you are if you decide that morality, if you decide to go against if you decide that transcendent, do a different way of constructing morality other than a transcendent way. Now, thankfully, as we'll see, a lot of people who hold to they're not as consistent as Nietzsche was. They'll hold to ideas from a transcendent morality even though they have removed the grounding for believing in them. So what does this have to do with theism, the belief in a creator God? So transcendent morality is, as we've mentioned, it's consistent with the way that we speak and act regarding morality. And if true, it implies a transcendent standard, a standard that is outside of ourselves, outside of humanity. Okay, well, this is strongly consistent with the theistic conception of God, because what is our conception of God? Well, God is someone who is outside of us, who created us, and therefore to think that God would make the rules for us is very sensible. And in fact, it's difficult to find an account of transcendent morality that is consistent with other conceptions of God. So if you think about materialism, if humans are just accidents, it's hard to understand why there would be a transcendent ought around human actions. If we're accidents, then anything we do is accidents. And so it's difficult how you would pull that someone ought to do something out of that. Pantheism, if we're a part of God, then what we say goes, because it would not be outside of us, it would actually be inside of us. And it would be us who are constructing this morality. because we are part of God. If it was polytheism, well, if there's a single universal standard, then it would need to have a single source, and this is somewhat inconsistent with polytheism. Now, as we mentioned before, you can be moral without God. That is not it is not the claim of the moral argument that we need God to be good. It's that we need the concept of God to have a concept of what is moral. So, according to Christian thought, everybody is capable of at least some good because we're all created in the image of God. We're all able to know morality, at least in part, because God's written it on our hearts. And as we've shown, there's no grounding for a belief in a transcendent morality apart from God. And so atheists often confuse this argument by trying to answer the question of whether they can, they confuse the question of whether they can provide grounding for morality with the question of whether they can know morality or perform moral acts. And so this is the confusion that often lies about complaints about this argument. They'll say, well, I do good things. I do better things than some particular Christian does. And say, well, that's not what the moral argument is about. The argument is not about whether or not you can know the good or do the good. The question is, can you give a sufficient cause for there being a distinction between good and evil? And so this also goes into education. Because if you don't have a transcendent view of morality, even though it doesn't impact your ability to do good, it actually does impact your ability to teach the good. Because if you think about this, if you teach moral conclusions to people without justifying their transcendence, you're just teaching someone preferences. You're saying this is the way that we like to do it. And so the people who hear that, if they don't believe, if they just say, oh, well, that's just the way that you like to do it, then they'll feel free to discard it in favor of their own preferences. So it does, although you can still know and do morality, it does make it harder to teach morality if you do not have a transcendent view of it. So there's a lot of criticisms to the moral argument. The one that we've focused on is the one that where there's a confusion as to what it actually says, but there's some direct criticisms of it as well. The first one is that atheists can justify morality, and the biggest person who makes this criticism is Sam Harris. His book, The Moral Landscape. Many atheists say that they can indeed justify morality without a transcendent standard, but if you really pay attention to them, usually what's happening is they're sneaking transcendent they'll sneak in like a single transcendent principle in through the back door, and then they'll use that to justify all the other principles that they might want to justify. Okay, and so what they'll do is they'll say, well, you'll say, hey, you snuck that in through the back door, and they're like, well, are you saying that that's not a good principle? And you're like, well, no, I'm not saying that. And say, well, okay, well, it's a good principle. We agree, so I can use it. Well, no, that's not the same thing. Agreeing that the principle that they snuck in through the back door is not the same thing as agreeing that they have justified the usage of that principle in their system. And so they'll often make this confusion that will it's kind of a smoke screen so that they can justify the importation of what might be at least a vaguely Christian-like standard by just saying, well, since we all agree on it, I can do that. But that's not how you justify things. So Sam Harris, in his moral landscape, the principle he talks about is human flourishing or human well-being. And so he says that the goal of morality is to maximize human well-being. And so that might be a decent principle on its own, but he doesn't justify why that should be a principle. So, for example, some people think that humans are actually the problem. And so therefore, if you think that humans are the problem, well, what would you do? You'd want to get rid of humans. That's not human well-being. And so therefore, you'd have to justify why you think human well-being should be the thing that we are optimizing for. And then there's a lot of other issues with that principle if it's taken alone, which is why in transcendent morality there's actually a number of principles, not just a single principle. But he tries to bring in one principle and then use it as much as he can. but he doesn't justify even that one principle. So again, he points out that we all agree that human flourishing is a good thing, but again, he's not grounded this principle in anything. So therefore, theism remains the sole source of grounding for any principles. And so, anyway, so you can see that atheists will tend to try to justify morality by taking a single principle, and sneaking in. The reason why it's a single principle usually is because it's easier to sneak in a single principle than to just have a lot of principles just popping in everywhere. Then people start to ask questions. If you have one, it's a lot easier to kind of slide by that one. So another criticism is that morality is culturally dependent. And so the criticism kind of goes like this. Well, every country has its own set of laws. They have their own set of standards. The way marriage works, you might believe in polygamy, you might not. There's different things that are crimes that are not crimes elsewhere. You might believe in gun rights, you might not believe in gun rights. There's societies that hold slaves, there's societies that are anti-slave. Therefore, since everyone does morality different, we can't claim that it's transcendent. And the thing about this view is that it actually confuses the minutiae with the fundamentals. The reason that we're even able to do this comparison between moral systems is because they're all, in fact, so similar to each other. The similarity is actually the big thing. And C.S. Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, came out with kind of what he views as the transcendent moral law. And the point of this is not to say this is the thing, but to recognize that these threads are in every culture. And so when we talk about the transcendent moral law, it's true that individual acts and individual things we may be unclear about. We may be unclear about, specific, how many wives we should have, and how exactly should this person be treated. But on the whole, the basics are the same. And if it's actually hard to think about how you would imagine a morality that did not include these threads. And so basically, his laws are these. So first of all, you have the law of general beneficence. So basically, there's a positive side, which is do beneficial things, and there's a negative side, don't do harmful things. Then there's the law of special beneficence, and this is that certain persons and relationships require special considerations. There are things that you should do for your wife that you might not do for everyone else. There are certain areas where you have special responsibility that you might not have elsewhere. If you are a leader, you have specific things that are required of you that are not required of other people. So there's the general beneficence that you should be doing good and you should not be doing harm. And there's special beneficence, which is there are circumstantial things that require additional things from you. Then everyone has a duty to parents, elders, and ancestors. And then everyone has a duty to children and posterity. There's a law of justice. That means that we have to have truth in our legal proceedings, or we have to have truth among one another. We have to have rectitude in our legal proceedings, and we have to have sexual decency. And so, again, the standards for those might vary, but there's no society that raises up the abandonment of these things. There's the law of good faith, that if I do something in good faith, it's kind of like handshake agreements. Every society has kind of this notion of we're not trying to get away with something. We all are kind of trying to enter into these agreements that we recognize are not fully fleshed out, but we're trying to make good faith efforts on them. There's the law of mercy and the law of magnanimity. Sorry about that. The law of magnanimity is, trying to just saying that you should be you should try to be a better person. You should try to do things which are out of a love for others and a compassion for others that is not even necessarily required of you. So anyway, so those are, C.S. Lewis goes through and points out that societies across the globe all believe in these things. And so when you think about it, our individual differences are small compared to our similarities, which we all view as being more or less the same. So then another criticism is the Euthyphro dilemma. And so this harkens back to an old dialogue from Plato. And so basically the way that this argument goes is that in the dialogue, Plato had a character who asked, are actions moral because God says or commands them, or did God command them because they are moral? Or I guess in his case it would be, so that's the way it's posited now. In that case, it would be the gods, right? Because Plato was in a polytheistic society. So are actions moral because the gods say or command them, or did the gods command them because they are moral? And so Plato's point was that if actions are moral because God or the gods command them, it means that evils such as torture would be moral simply if God changed his mind. So if God decided tomorrow, you know what, torture is good now, then then torture would be good. So that's a problem with saying that that morality comes from God, because if God changes his mind, then we're just going to have a completely different morality. So it can't just be based on a command of God, or at least it doesn't seem to be. So now if you respond that actions are moral whether or not God commands them, that means that there's a moral standard beyond even God's decrees, and that makes God irrelevant to the question of morality. And so basically they try to put you in this dilemma that says, either you have to say that it's just right because God commands it, and so therefore right and wrong is simply the arbitrary command of someone, or if it isn't just because God commands it, then you have to say that right and wrong is outside of God himself. And so they basically use this to say, if there is a transcendent morality, it has nothing to do with God, is kind of their idea from that. The answer, though, is that God is both the source of morality and the creator of the moral order. Okay, so it's that this comes out of God's nature. The reason why this worked in ancient times is because the gods in polytheism just kind of found themselves in creation, just like every other part of creation. So the gods were not above creation; they are actually part of it. In Christianity, God is the creator. So God created the world according to his nature. And so the moral order that we see in the world is actually reflective of his nature. And so God gives us commands, but the goal of the commands is to live in a manner that is consistent with that order that he created that's out of himself. So another way of saying this is that God commanded to do what is right according to the natural world that he designed according to his nature. So God himself is the standard with which his commands are aligned. So that's why the Euthyphro dilemma actually worked in the case of polytheism, but it does not work as an argument against theism, because in theism, God himself is the standard by which we're judging things.